The man dying in the snow was worth $3 billion, but up here, the mountain did not care. The wind screamed across the Colorado Ridge like a living thing, rattling the pine trees and swallowing the narrow trail beneath fresh snow. Visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. Even the rescue teams had already turned back. Nobody sane stayed on Black Hollow Mountain during a storm like this. But Clara Whitmore had never been very good at leaving things behind. Her boots crunched through nearly 3 feet of snow as she pulled her thick wool collar higher against the cold. Frost clung to the edges of her blonde hair beneath her knit cap, and every breath burned inside her lungs. The old lantern hanging from her snowmobile flickered weakly through the white darkness. Somewhere far below the ridge, thunder rolled beneath the mountain itself. Avalanche weather. Clara tightened her grip on the handlebars. Just a few more miles, she whispered to herself. The mountain answered with another violent gust that nearly shoved her sideways. She should have been home an hour ago. Her tiny cabin waited deep in the woods near Miller's Creek, warm with cedar smoke and the smell of soup simmering in the old cast-iron pot. But halfway down the ridge, she had seen something no storm could hide. Tracks, fresh ones. Snowmobile tracks cutting sharply off the main path. At first, she tried to ignore them. Tourists came up here every winter thinking expensive gear could outsmart nature. Most of them learned quickly. The lucky ones learned before it was too late. Clara almost kept driving. Almost. Then she saw the broken branch. Then the streak of dark red against the snow. Her stomach tightened instantly. She killed the engine. Silence crashed over the mountain so completely it felt unnatural. No birds. No movement. Only wind and the distant groaning of ice somewhere in the cliffs above. Clara grabbed the emergency flashlight from her pack and stepped into the storm. "Hello?" she shouted. The blizzard swallowed her voice whole. She followed the tracks for nearly 50 yards before she saw the wreckage. A black snowmobile lay tipped against a pine tree, half buried already. One ski was twisted completely backward. Nearby, a single leather glove sat frozen in the snow like someone had dropped it while running for their life. Clara's pulse quickened. Oh no! Then she saw him. A man collapsed near the edge of the ridge, barely visible beneath the blowing snow. His dark coat was covered in ice. One arm stretched weakly toward nothing. For one terrible second, Clara thought she was too late. She stumbled toward him, dropping to her knees beside his body. His skin was ice cold beneath her gloves. Snow covered his eyelashes. His lips had turned pale blue. But then, barely noticeable, a breath. Shallow. Fragile. Alive. Clara looked up at the sky as snow lashed across her face. The nearest ranger station was over 20 miles away. Her radio had lost signal an hour earlier. And the storm was getting worse by the minute. She looked back down at the stranger. Even buried in snow, there was something expensive about him. The watch on his wrist probably cost more than her entire cabin. But none of that mattered now. Up here, money froze just like everything else. Clara swallowed hard, then hooked her arms beneath his shoulders. "Don't die on me," she whispered into the storm. "Not tonight." The mountain fought her every inch of the way down. Snow blasted sideways across the trail, stinging Clara's face like tiny shards of ice while the old snowmobile groaned beneath the extra weight. The unconscious man slumped against the rescue sled tied behind her machine, wrapped in every blanket she carried. Twice, the sled nearly tipped into the ravine beside the trail. Twice, Clara jumped off into waist-deep snow to steady it with trembling hands. Her fingers had gone numb nearly 20 minutes ago. She could not feel her toes anymore either. But every few seconds she glanced back to make sure the stranger was still breathing. That tiny cloud of breath in the freezing air became the only thing keeping her moving. "Come on," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Stay with me." Above them, the sky darkened into a deep iron gray. Night was coming fast. In Black Hollow, darkness was dangerous even on clear evenings. During a storm, it could kill. The trail curved sharply through a forest of towering pine trees bent heavy beneath snow. Their branches creaked overhead like old wooden ships caught at sea. Clara leaned forward against the handlebars as the engine struggled uphill. Her father used to say the mountain could smell fear. The moment you panicked, it swallowed you whole. She remembered him teaching her these trails when she was 10 years old, his thick gloved hands guiding hers over the controls while snow drifted softly around them. Respect the mountain, he always told her. But never stop listening to your instincts. Her instincts had brought her here tonight. And now they might get both of them killed. The cabin finally appeared through the storm nearly 40 minutes later. A tiny shape buried deep among the trees with smoke curling weakly from the stone chimney. Relief hit Clara so hard her knees almost buckled. She parked beside the porch and rushed toward the rescue sled. The man had not moved once. Ice coated the edges of his dark beard now. His expensive winter coat felt stiff beneath her frozen hands. Up close, he looked older than she first thought. Maybe early 40s. Sharp features. Exhausted even in unconsciousness. Like someone who had not truly slept in years. Okay, Clara muttered, forcing strength into her voice. One more push. Getting him inside took nearly all the energy she had left. She dragged him slowly across the porch floorboards, boots scraping against old wood while the storm screamed outside the cabin walls. The second the door slammed shut behind them, warmth wrapped around her like a living thing. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke, coffee grounds, and the faint scent of pine sap from the stacked firewood beside the stove. It was small. Just one main room with an old leather couch, a narrow kitchen, and blankets folded neatly beside the fireplace. But to Clara it was safe. She dropped to her knees beside the stranger and pressed shaking fingers against his neck again. Still breathing. Barely. She moved quickly then, survival instincts taking over. More firewood into the stove. Dry blankets. Warm water heating in an old kettle. She peeled away his frozen gloves carefully and stopped for a second when she saw his hands. No calluses. No roughness. A silver watch gleamed beneath the lantern light, elegant and impossibly expensive. Clara frowned slightly. Men like this did not belong on mountains alone during blizzards. Outside, thunder rolled again beneath the snow-covered peaks. The windows rattled softly. Clara wrapped another blanket around his shoulders and looked at the stranger lying unconscious beside her fire. "Who are you?" she whispered quietly. The man did not answer. But somewhere beyond the storm, the mountain already knew. The stranger finally moved just after midnight. Clara had been sitting beside the fireplace wrapped in a thick flannel blanket, watching the storm batter the cabin windows while the kettle hissed softly on the stove. Exhaustion weighed heavily behind her eyes, but she did not dare sleep deeply. Not with a man half frozen lying 10 feet away. The fire cracked gently, throwing warm orange light across the room when suddenly she heard it. A weak breath. Then a low groan. Clara sat upright immediately. The man's fingers twitched beneath the blankets. His face tightened slightly like he was fighting his way out of a nightmare. Clara stood and crossed the room carefully. "Hey," she said softly. "Easy." His eyes opened halfway. Pale gray. Disoriented. For a second, they darted around the cabin with the sharp alertness of someone expecting danger. Then confusion settled in. "Where?" His voice cracked badly. Clara handed him a cup of warm water. "You are safe. You crashed your snowmobile about 6 miles north of Miller Ridge." He stared at her for a moment before taking the cup with shaking hands. Even now, despite the exhaustion carved into his face, there was something controlled about him. Disciplined. Like a man used to hiding weakness. "How long?" he asked quietly. "A few hours." He nodded faintly and tried to sit up too quickly. Pain flashed across his expression. Clara gently pushed him back against the couch. "Do not be stupid," she said. "Your body temperature was dangerously low." For the first time, the corner of his mouth almost moved. "Almost. You always talk to strangers like that. Only the ones I drag out of blizzards." Silence settled between them after that. Outside, Snow hammered against the roof in violent waves. The entire cabin creaked softly beneath the storm. The stranger looked toward the fire instead of at her. His expensive coat now hung drying beside the stove, and without it he seemed strangely less intimidating. Just tired. Deeply tired. Clara poured soup into a bowl and handed it to him. Slowly, she warned. He accepted it with quiet politeness. The silver watch still circled his wrist, catching flickers of firelight. Clara noticed he had not answered a single personal question yet. Not his name. Not where he came from. Nothing. Most people would have explained themselves by now. But this man seemed almost afraid of being known. He ate in silence for several minutes before finally speaking again. You live up here alone? Clara nodded once. Most of the year. His eyes moved slowly around the cabin. The shelves of old books. The worn pine table. The stack of chopped firewood by the door. A faded photograph resting near the lantern. Does not seem easy. Clara followed his gaze toward the photograph of her father smiling beside an old fishing boat years ago. It is quieter than the city. Something unreadable passed across the stranger's face then. Not amusement. Not disagreement. Recognition. Like those words hit somewhere deeper than she intended. The radio sitting on the kitchen counter suddenly crackled through static. Both of them looked up instantly. A weather alert interrupted the silence. Severe winter conditions remain active across Black Hollow County. Search operations for missing persons have been suspended until morning due to avalanche risk. Clara frowned slightly. Missing persons. The stranger's expression changed almost too fast to notice. His hand tightened around the soup bowl. Just slightly. But Clara saw it. She had spent enough years alone in the mountains to notice small things. Fear looked different on everyone. Some people shouted. Some panicked. Others became very still. This man became still. The radio continued through bursts of static. Authorities advise all residents to remain indoors overnight. The stranger quietly reached forward and switched the radio off before the announcement finished. The cabin fell silent again except for the wind. Then finally, without looking at her, he spoke in a low, exhausted voice. Please, he said. Do not tell anyone I am here. Clara did not answer right away. The fire crackled softly between them while snow battered the cabin roof hard enough to shake loose small drifts from the chimney outside. She studied the man carefully across the flickering orange light. Most people stranded on Black Hollow Mountain reacted one of two ways: relief or panic. But this stranger looked like a man terrified of being found. He sat quietly beneath the heavy wool blankets, one hand wrapped around the warm soup bowl while the other rested tensely against his knee. Waiting. Listening. Like danger might already be climbing the mountain toward him. Clara finally leaned back into her chair. That depends, she said calmly. Should someone be looking for you? His jaw tightened slightly. Not enough for most people to notice. But Clara noticed everything. Probably, he admitted after a long pause. Family? She asked. He stared into the fire. Something like that. Another vague answer. Clara almost smiled to herself. Whoever this man was, he had spent years learning how to speak without revealing anything real. Outside, the storm howled through the trees with deep, mournful whistles that sounded almost human. The cabin lights flickered once. Then again. Clara stood immediately and grabbed the kerosene lantern from the shelf. Power lines freeze up during storms, she explained. It happens every winter. The stranger watched her move around the cabin with quiet attention while she lit the lantern and set it near the fireplace. Warm golden light spread softly across the room now, making the cabin feel smaller somehow. More intimate. Safer. Clara moved toward the window and peeked through the frost gathering on the glass. Nothing but white darkness and endless falling snow. Nobody is coming up this mountain tonight, she said quietly. Even the rescue teams shut down after dark. For the first time since waking up, the stranger seemed to breathe easier. Just slightly. Clara noticed that too. She crossed back toward the kitchen counter and poured fresh coffee into 2 old ceramic mugs. You have a name? She asked over her shoulder. Silence lingered behind her. Then finally, Ethan. She handed him the mug. Clara. Their fingers brushed briefly as he accepted it. His hands were warmer now, though faint redness still lingered across his knuckles from the cold. He wrapped both hands around the coffee like someone holding on to the last warmth left in the world. The wind outside suddenly slammed hard against the cabin walls. Ethan glanced sharply toward the door on instinct. Clara raised an eyebrow. You expecting someone? He looked away almost immediately. No, but the answer came too fast. Clara sat quietly beside the fire again. She had lived alone long enough to understand silence better than conversation. Some people carried loneliness. Others carried secrets. Ethan looked like a man carrying both. Minutes passed with only the sound of crackling wood and distant wind filling the room. Then Ethan's eyes landed on the photograph near the lantern again. The old fishing boat. The smiling man beside it. Your husband? Clara shook her head softly. My father. Ethan nodded once. He lives nearby. The question hung in the warm cabin air for a moment too long. Clara lowered her eyes toward the fire. Not anymore. Understanding crossed Ethan's face immediately. I am sorry. She shrugged lightly, though the ache never truly left. He died during a storm about 12 years ago. Ethan looked back toward the raging darkness outside the windows. On this mountain? Clara nodded. Trying to rescue 2 hikers who ignored a weather warning. The fire popped sharply between them. Did he save them? Ethan asked quietly. Clara stared into the flames for several seconds before answering. Yes, she whispered. But the mountain kept him. Silence filled the cabin again after that. Heavy. Honest. For the first time all night, Ethan no longer looked like a stranger hiding from the world. He looked like a man who finally understood exactly where he was. Morning arrived slowly on Black Hollow Mountain. The storm had weakened some time before dawn, leaving behind a silence so complete it almost felt sacred. Snow covered everything outside Clara's cabin in thick untouched waves that shimmered pale blue beneath the early light. The world looked frozen in time. Inside, warmth still lingered from the fire burning through the night. Clara stood near the kitchen stove flipping pancakes in an old iron skillet, while soft country music crackled quietly through the radio beside her. The smell of coffee and maple syrup filled the cabin. It was the kind of peaceful morning she had once imagined sharing with someone long ago, before life became smaller and quieter after her father died. Behind her, Ethan sat wrapped in one of her father's old flannel blankets near the window. He looked stronger than the night before, though exhaustion still clung to him heavily. His dark hair remained slightly damp from melted snow, and faint bruising colored one side of his forehead from the crash. But his eyes were clearer now. Observant. Careful. Clara noticed he had spent most of the morning watching the mountain outside instead of speaking. You always this quiet? She asked while pouring fresh coffee into his mug. Ethan glanced toward her. Usually people prefer quiet. Clara set the mug in front of him. That depends on what they are trying not to say. For the first time, a genuine smile almost appeared on his face before disappearing again just as quickly. He lowered his eyes toward the coffee. You always analyze strangers this much? Clara shrugged lightly. Living alone teaches you to pay attention. Ethan nodded slowly like he understood that better than she realized. The radio crackled suddenly with a morning news update. Search efforts continue today for missing technology executive Ethan Vale after severe weather interrupted rescue operations overnight. Authorities believe Mr. Vale may still be stranded somewhere within the Black Hollow region after his personal snowmobile signal disappeared yesterday afternoon. Clara froze beside the stove. The spatula slipped slightly in her hand. Slowly, she turned toward the table. Ethan did not move. He simply reached over calmly and lowered the radio volume until the announcer's voice faded into static. Silence swallowed the cabin. Clara stared at him for several long seconds. Then at the silver watch resting beside his coffee mug. Then back at him again. The expensive coat. The controlled way he spoke. The fear every time the radio mentioned search teams. Suddenly every strange detail clicked together all at once. Ethan Vale, she said quietly. He looked out the frosted window instead of at her. Yes. Clara let out a soft breath of disbelief. Even living deep in the mountains, she knew the name. Everyone did. Billionaire founder of Vale Systems. Magazine covers. Television interviews. Articles calling him the man who reinvented modern technology before 40. Reporters followed him everywhere. Investors treated him like royalty. You are the man they have been searching for on every news channel all winter, Clara said. Ethan remained silent. She crossed her arms slowly. You could have told me. Would it have changed anything? Clara opened her mouth to answer but stopped. The truth caught her off guard. No. She still would have pulled him out of the snow. Ethan finally looked at her then, and for the first time she saw something beneath the polished control he carried. Not arrogance. Not entitlement. Weariness. The kind that settled deep into a person's bones. I did not disappear by accident, he admitted quietly. Then why run? Ethan stared down into his untouched coffee for a long moment before answering. Because sometimes, he said softly, a man can build an empire so large, he no longer recognizes the person living inside it. The storm finally passed by late afternoon, but Black Hollow Mountain still felt trapped beneath a world of ice and silence. Sunlight spilled softly across the endless snowfields outside Clara's cabin, turning the frozen landscape into silver and gold. Icicles hung from the roof like glass knives, glittering in the pale winter light. Inside, the cabin had grown warmer. Softer somehow. Ethan stood carefully near the wood stove wearing one of Clara's father's old sweaters while steam rose from a fresh pot of chili simmering on the stove. The expensive billionaire from the news now looked strangely ordinary standing barefoot on worn wooden floors holding a mug of coffee with both hands. Clara noticed the contrast immediately. Men like Ethan usually belonged in skyscrapers and television studios, not tiny mountain cabins with squeaky floorboards and patched windows. Yet somehow, the cabin suited him more than the headlines probably ever had. Ethan glanced toward the stack of chopped firewood beside the door. You cut all of that yourself? Clara nodded while stirring the chili. Winter up here teaches you quickly. Either you prepare or you freeze. Ethan looked thoughtfully toward the fire. In my world, preparation means hiring experts. Clara smirked faintly. Out here the mountain does not care how much money you have. A quiet laugh escaped him then. Real this time. Small, tired, but real. It changed his face completely for a second. Clara realized she had never seen a photograph of Ethan Vale smiling naturally before. Public pictures always showed him sharp and controlled beside glass buildings and billion-dollar announcements. But this version of him looked different. Less polished. More human. Ethan slowly walked toward the cabin window and stared out across the frozen valley below. Smoke curled lazily from distant cabins hidden among the trees miles away. I used to think success would make life quieter, he admitted softly. Instead, it made everything louder. Clara leaned against the kitchen counter listening. Ethan continued speaking without turning around. Phones never stop ringing. Investors. Interviews. Lawsuits. Meetings. Every room filled with people wanting something from you. His reflection stared back at him faintly through the frosted glass. After a while, you stop knowing whether anyone sees you anymore, or just the empire around you. Clara lowered her eyes slightly. She understood loneliness better than most people. Just a different kind. Ethan finally looked back at her. You ever regret staying up here alone? Clara thought for a moment before answering. Sometimes during storms. Ethan nodded faintly. And the rest of the time? She glanced around the little cabin. The fire. The mountains outside. Her father's photograph resting quietly near the lantern. The rest of the time, she said softly, It feels honest. Something in that answer hit Ethan harder than he expected. Clara could see it in his face immediately. Before he could respond, a sharp buzzing sound suddenly shattered the calm. Ethan froze instantly. The sound came from his coat hanging beside the stove. Clara watched as he crossed the room quickly and reached into the inside pocket. A sleek black phone lit up in his hand. Missed calls covered the screen. Dozens of them. Names. Executives. Reporters. Emergency alerts. Ethan stared at the device silently while it buzzed again in his palm. Clara noticed the change immediately. His shoulders tightened. The warmth disappeared from his expression almost instantly, replaced by that same guarded distance from the night before. Like the outside world had finally found him again. The phone continued vibrating between them in the quiet cabin. Then Ethan slowly pressed the power button until the screen went dark. Complete silence returned. Clara looked at him carefully. You really do not want them finding you. Ethan slipped the dead phone back into his coat pocket and stared toward the falling evening light outside the window. You save a man from freezing to death, he said quietly, and suddenly he remembers why he was trying so hard to disappear. That night, the mountain sky cleared for the first time in days. Thousands of stars spread above Black Hollow like shattered diamonds scattered across velvet darkness. Snow reflected pale moonlight across the frozen valley, making the entire world glow silver outside Clara's cabin windows. Inside, the fire burned low and steady while the scent of cedar smoke drifted softly through the room. Ethan sat at the small wooden table slowly turning an old compass through his fingers. Clara noticed it immediately. It had belonged to her father. The brass edges were scratched from years of use, and the faded initials carved into the back had nearly worn smooth with time. You still carry this around? Ethan asked quietly. Clara nodded from the couch where she sat repairing one of her winter gloves with dark thread. My father said a compass matters more when storms make everything look the same. Ethan studied the old compass carefully beneath the lantern light. Smart man. Clara smiled faintly. Most days. Silence settled comfortably between them after that. Not awkward anymore. Just quiet. The kind that only exists between two tired people no longer pretending to be strangers. Outside, wind brushed gently through the pine trees, softer now. Almost peaceful. Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair. You ever think about leaving this place? Clara tied off the thread carefully before answering. People ask me that all the time. And? Clara glanced toward the mountains outside the frosted glass. I think some people belong to cities, she said softly. And some belong to places where they can hear themselves think. Ethan lowered his eyes slightly at that. I cannot remember the last time my life was quiet enough to hear anything. Clara studied him carefully across the warm cabin light. What happened to you, Ethan? For a moment, she thought he might avoid the question again. But something about the mountains seemed to strip layers off people. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe the silence. Or maybe survival reminded people how exhausting it was to keep pretending. Ethan rested the compass gently on the table. My younger brother died 3 years ago. Clara's expression softened instantly. Ethan stared toward the fire while speaking, his voice low and steady. Connor worked with me at Vale Systems from the beginning. He was the one person who never cared about the money. A faint smile touched Ethan's face briefly. He used to tell me the company was becoming too big. Too cold. The fire cracked softly between them. One night he collapsed in his office after working nearly 36 hours straight. Clara lowered her eyes. Ethan swallowed once before continuing. Heart failure. He was 38. The cabin grew very still after that. Clara understood grief well enough to recognize the sound of it hiding beneath a calm voice. Ethan stared into the flames like he still saw something there he could not fix. After Connor died, everything changed, he admitted quietly. The board wanted more expansion. More investors. More pressure. Every meeting became about profit margins and market control. His jaw tightened slightly. And every time I looked around those rooms, I realized nobody even remembered the human beings inside the company anymore. Clara listened without interrupting. Ethan gave a tired shake of his head. I built something so large it started consuming the people around it. Clara looked toward her father's photograph near the lantern. My father used to say mountains reveal people for who they really are. Ethan glanced at her. And what do they reveal about me? Clara studied him carefully for several long seconds. Not the billionaire from magazine covers. Not the powerful executive from television interviews. Just the exhausted man sitting alone in her father's old sweater beneath warm firelight. That you are tired, she said gently. Not evil. Just tired. Something fragile moved across Ethan's face then. Relief, maybe. Or sadness. Outside, snow slipped softly from the pine branches under the weight of the cold night. And for the first time in years, Ethan Vale sat in complete silence without anyone asking him for a single thing. By the third morning, the mountain no longer felt like a prison. Sunlight poured across the snow-covered valley in long golden ribbons, and smoke drifted peacefully from Clara's chimney into the crisp winter air. The storm had left behind a world so clean and bright it almost hurt to look at. Ethan stood outside the cabin for the first time since the crash, breathing slowly beneath the sharp cold sky. Snow crunched beneath his borrowed boots while Clara split firewood a few yards away with steady practice swings. The sound echoed softly through the trees. Ethan watched her quietly for a moment. You do that every morning? Clara drove the axe cleanly through another log. Wood stove does not feed itself. Ethan shook his head faintly with something close to admiration. In my world, nobody even makes their own coffee anymore. Clara smirked without looking at him. Sounds exhausting. Ethan looked out across the endless white mountains stretching toward the horizon. Strange how quickly silence had started feeling normal here. In the city, silence usually meant something was wrong. Here, silence felt alive. Honest. He had almost forgotten what that felt like. Clara gathered another armful of firewood and motioned toward the cabin porch. Stack those for me if you are feeling strong enough. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. You giving orders now? You are alive because of me, Clara replied calmly. That technically makes me the boss. To Ethan's own surprise, he laughed again. Easier this time. The sound disappeared softly into the cold mountain air. A few minutes later they sat together on the porch steps drinking coffee while pale sunlight glittered across the frozen valley below. Ethan noticed how different time felt here. Slower. Cleaner somehow. No meetings waiting. No flashing headlines. No executives demanding answers. Just wind through pine trees and the distant cry of an eagle somewhere beyond the cliffs. Clara tucked loose strands of blonde hair beneath her knit cap and glanced sideways at him. You know they are probably losing their minds looking for you right now. Ethan stared quietly into his coffee cup. Probably. Does not bother you? He thought about that for a moment. It should. Clara studied him carefully. But? Ethan looked out toward the mountains again. But this is the first time in years I have woken up without feeling like the world was already pulling pieces off me before breakfast. Before Clara could answer, the distant sound of engines suddenly echoed faintly through the valley below. Both of them froze instantly. Ethan's expression changed first. Clara saw it happen in real time. Calm disappearing. Shoulders tightening. Eyes scanning instinctively toward the tree line. The sound grew louder for several seconds before fading again into the mountains. Snowmobiles somewhere far below. Search teams, maybe? Clara looked at Ethan carefully. You really think somebody is after you? Ethan lowered his voice slightly. Not after me. His jaw tightened. After Control. Clara frowned. Ethan leaned forward slowly, elbows resting against his knees. 3 weeks ago, I refused to approve a merger worth almost $40 billion. Clara blinked softly at the number. Ethan barely seemed to notice. The board wanted complete automation across several divisions. Thousands of employees replaced within a year. His expression darkened slightly. Connor would have hated it. The wind brushed cold against the porch as Ethan continued quietly. When I said no, people I trusted started treating me like an obstacle instead of a person. Clara watched him closely. You think somebody forced you out? Ethan stared down toward the valley where the engine sounds had disappeared. I think powerful people become dangerous when money is the only thing left they believe in. Silence settled heavily between them after that. Then suddenly, from somewhere deep in the forest below, a distant cry shattered the stillness. Faint. Panicked. Human. Clara stood instantly. Ethan looked toward the trees. The cry came again through the cold mountain air. Somebody was out there. The cry came again, thinner this time, carried through the frozen trees by the mountain wind. Clara was already moving before the sound faded. She grabbed her heavy coat from the hook beside the door and reached for the emergency flashlight hanging near the porch. Ethan stood immediately. What was that? Clara's expression tightened as she listened carefully toward the forest below. Somebody is in trouble. Ethan glanced toward the endless snow-covered trees stretching beneath the ridge. In this weather? Clara pulled on her gloves quickly. Tourists ignore warnings every year. Another faint cry drifted upward through the mountain air. Younger this time. Fearful. Ethan saw the change in Clara instantly. The same determination he had seen the night she dragged him out of the storm. Without hesitation, she stepped toward the snowmobile parked beside the cabin. Ethan followed her. You are not going alone. Clara turned sharply. You can barely walk straight. I am coming anyway. The wind whipped snow across the porch between them while they stared at each other for one tense second. Then Clara exhaled heavily. Fine. But you listen to me out there. Within minutes, they were descending the narrow forest trail together. The snowmobile headlights sliced through towering pine trees heavy with snow, while icy wind clawed across Ethan's face. Clara drove fast but controlled, eyes scanning constantly between the trees. Ethan gripped the side rails tightly behind her as the machine bounced across frozen ground hidden beneath fresh snow. The mountain looked different now. Wilder. Less peaceful than before. Black Hollow had a way of reminding people that beauty and danger often lived side by side. The cry echoed again suddenly, much closer this time. Clara killed the engine immediately. Silence crashed over the forest. Then they heard it clearly. Sobbing. Somewhere downhill beyond the trees. Clara grabbed the flashlight and moved carefully through waist-deep snow. Ethan followed close behind despite the cold burning through his lungs. Branches cracked softly beneath heavy snow overhead while wind hissed through the dark woods. Then the flashlight beam found movement. A little boy huddled beneath a fallen pine tree, wrapped in a bright red winter jacket far too thin for the mountain cold. He could not have been older than 9. Tears streaked across his frozen cheeks as he looked up at them with terrified blue eyes. Relief hit his face so fast it almost broke Clara's heart. Hey, she said gently, kneeling beside him. You are okay now. The boy's lips trembled badly from cold. My dad went for help, he whispered. But he never came back. Clara exchanged a quick look with Ethan. The mountains suddenly felt much larger around them. Ethan crouched beside the child carefully. What is your name, buddy? Noah. Ethan removed his own gloves and wrapped them gently around the boy's shaking hands. How long have you been out here, Noah? Since yesterday. Clara's stomach tightened instantly. Ethan looked toward the dark forest surrounding them. Snow still clung dangerously to the steep cliffs higher above the ridge. Avalanche territory. Clara pulled a thermal blanket from her pack and wrapped it tightly around Noah's shoulders. We need to move now, she said quietly. Then somewhere deep in the mountain above them came a sound Clara knew too well. A low thunderous crack rolling through the frozen cliffs. The snow beneath Ethan's boots trembled slightly. Noah's frightened eyes widened. Clara looked sharply toward the upper ridge, her face turning pale beneath the flashlight glow. Avalanche, she whispered. For one terrifying second, nobody moved. Then high above the trees, snow began falling from the cliffs like a white wall swallowing the mountain itself.